They called him the Sun King, a man who claimed divine authority, believed to be chosen by God himself, whose mere presence was said to light up the world. But in his last chapter, Louis XIV of France became something much more horrifying than any mortal ruler ever should become. A living embodiment of rot, a grotesque reminder that even the strongest among us are nothing but flesh, headed for mortality. What you're about to learn isn't the mere story of the death of a king. It's the painful, ghastly disintegration of an entire worldview, laid bare in graphic, disturbing detail that royal historians struggled to cover up. This is the account of how Europe's greatest monarch spent his final weeks, not in glory, but as a decaying corpse who just wouldn't quit, and how his devoted subjects, who had once stood in awe of his presence, stood in shock as their so-called God-king turned out to be nothing but a dying, fouled, frightened old man. For 72 years, Louis XIV reigned France with unlimited power, veiled in splendor and ritual. He took a patchwork medieval kingdom and turned it into Europe's most preeminent power, elevated the Palace of Versailles as a jewel of absolutism, and persuaded a whole continent that he was God's chosen to rule. But by 1715, at the age of 76, he had outlived his son, his grandson, and most of his own contemporaries, alone now as the last remnant of a passing age. France itself had transformed. No longer Louis's golden kingdom in his youth, the nation was in distress. Constant wars had drained the royal coffers, harsh winters had brought famine and death, and the nobility, once vying for royal favor, had tired of the stifling rituals at Versailles. The great court, which had once been the envy of Europe, had now become an empty theater, where decaying nobles played out their routines before a disintegrating king who increasingly appeared more spirit than monarch. But Louis refused to confront reality. Even as his physical strength dwindled and his country groaned under the burdens of war, debt, and disillusionment, he tenaciously held on to his ritualized existence. Every morning he went through the lever, the elaborate dressing ceremony in front of a chosen group of nobles. Every night he received foreign visitors and petitioners as if his authority still exercised the same divine authority it had enjoyed formerly. The tragic irony? Louis, who acted the role of absolute monarch, had already been bypassed. Actual decisions were being taken by his ministers. His generals operated independently of him. And among the nobles, hushed conversations had started. What would happen when the old king eventually died? The Sun King was declining, but he would not acknowledge night had fallen. By summer of 1715, his closest associates started noticing alarming changes. The robust king, with his proud display of health and regal demeanor, appeared to be dwindling. His grand finery now appeared to swallow him whole. His legendary appetite diminished. The sybaritic court banquets, once the royal displays of plenty, were now awkward affairs as he nibbled indifferently at his food. Worse still was his deteriorating mental condition. The king who dominated every room now looked lost, disoriented, gazing off into space in meetings, repeating himself in speech. His doctors, used to curing petty illnesses and symbolic sickness, started whispering among themselves. Something was definitely amiss, but none of them dared broach the subject with the king. Then, in July, the first unmistakable sign came. Louis started complaining of pain in his left leg. It was dismissed as a strain, maybe from too much standing at court functions. He was 76 after all, Aches were to be expected, but this pain was different, sharp, pounding, and worsening by the day. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, the king's royal doctor, ordered the standard 18th century treatment: bloodletting, purging, and poultices. But nothing succeeded. In fact, they made the king weaker and more disturbed. Nobody still acknowledged that they were dealing with something out of their control. By August, the pain was intolerable. Louis barely walked, cane and the surreptitious assistance of his valet. The rituals he had maintained for 70 years were almost impossible to resume. Standing for hours, strolling Versailles' huge halls, these were now tortures. Yet he would not cancel a single appearance. He would not permit his mask to slip, not yet. But there were others who knew the truth. His stance bent. His powdered face no longer hid the paleness beneath. And then there was the odor, a faint, decaying scent that no perfume could cover up. Something within him was shifting, dying. By the middle of August, it could no longer be ignored. What started as an unfamiliar ache had grown into something much worse. By late August, the fiction of health could no longer be maintained. The flesh around the king's left leg had darkened and blotched, more than a bruise, and no longer something the court doctors could discount with optimistic falsehoods. What had begun as a foul smell now permeated the royal chambers, overwhelming even the most potent perfumes. Servants started asking to be reassigned, desperate to flee from the choking smell and horrific sight of their king's deterioration. Dr. Fagan, long the king's health steward, was at last compelled to face the ghastly reality. This was no mere sprain or exhaustion. Advice from royal court and Paris medical faculty colleagues only produced more unsuccessful remedies and a racking frustration. Bloodletting, herbs, spiritual rituals, none of these, it seemed, stemmed the king's decline. Rather, each treatment seemed to leach what life was left in his once mighty physique. Then the terror became irrefutable. By the last week of August, Louis's leg had started to rot. Gangrene, a disease that medicine of the period had no way to prevent, had taken hold and was spreading. The king's body was rotting while he was still alive. His faithful valet, once tasked with dressing the most imposing man in Europe, now had a nightmare every day, caring for a limb that was now black, oozing, and foul to describe. The same royal stockings that before held royal grace were now employed to conceal the ghastly truth. And yet, amidst unimaginable pain and corruption, Louis would not forsake his rituals. He still played the king. He still wore full court dress. He still welcomed nobles and ambassadors as if there was nothing amiss, as if his throne were not drenched in disease. The courtiers, who had previously competed to be close to him, now rushed to get away from him without becoming sick. The royal rooms, once scented with flowers and powdered wigs, now smelled of death. Even the palace staff, conditioned to withstand with honor, had had enough. Several left their stations, feigning illnesses to stay away from the king's chambers. Those who stayed did so through deep devotion and suffered for it. Conditions became insupportable, both physically and psychologically. As the gangrene progressed, it started taking over not only his leg but more. The black rot spread through his body, devouring more meat. His breath was no longer pleasant. His commanding voice now had the odor of putrefaction. Guests described a choking aura, as if the air itself around him had become tainted. Desperate and without recourse, Dr. Fagan suggested what they had so long shunned: amputation, a violent, almost invariably lethal operation at the time, particularly in the absence of anesthetic. Louis at first declined, holding on to his divine status. But as the agony mounted and the rot became unmistakable, even he started to doubt. In one last effort to rescue him, priests were called for. Holy relics were applied to his body. Special masses were said in his name. But none of these efforts could turn back what had already started. The man who had professed God's blessing now stood against a reality no faith could shield him from. Death was imminent, and it came not with honor, but with decay and devastation. All the while, Louis persisted in insisting on kingship's pomp and pageantry. Every morning, his valet dressed him in layers of embroidered silk and lace, draping fabric to cover over the rotting flesh underneath. Every day court hearings took place, though shorter, quieter, and progressively empty. Those who had previously worshipped the Sun King were now traumatized. Many suffered graphic nightmares. Some muttered forbidden ideas. If God's chosen leader could rot this way, what did that say for the divine right of kings? What did it say for the very concept of monarchy? By the early days of September, Louis could no longer avoid it. The agony was relentless and burning. The stench so overwhelming, even he was revolted by himself. For the first time in 76 years, the Sun King faced death, not as a monarch in glory, but as a frail man toward a humiliating, protracted demise. It was then, at last, that he agreed to the operation. Preparations were made for the operation to amputate, a violent progression where the infected bone was sawed through with no anesthetic, only pure strength and prayer. It was too late, though the gangrene had advanced too far. Amputation of the leg would not save him, merely hasten his death. And perhaps Louis XIV had also learned. There would be no salvaging him. As September stretched out, the atrocities within the royal bedchambers worsened, one that defied explanation, logic, or medicine. Court insiders started speculating that the king had begun communicating with ghosts. He was heard talking to people who weren't there, ordering long-dead relatives and courtiers around as if they stood before him. He commanded invisible servants, replied to questions nobody had asked, and spoke in muttered private confessions into empty air. The royal rooms, already redolent with the smell of corruption, now breathed an otherworldly, almost supernatural fear. Some suspected that the king was haunted by infection and by guilt. Religion had always been the cornerstone of Louis XIV's existence. He had created Versailles not just as a palace, but as a holy platform where he acted as God's designated monarch. But now, as his body began to disintegrate before his very eyes, even the most pious courtiers started to pose disquieting questions. Was this horrific death a punishment from heaven? The royal chaplain, generally self-assured in his duties, was shaken. How do you give last rites to a man already half dead, if that, and still refuses to cease pretending to rule the living? Masses were said. Holy relics were brought to bed by his side, but the rituals seemed hollow, their religious purpose at odds violently with the physical, ugly collapse of the king. And yet, his body continued to break down. By mid-September, the gangrene had spread beyond recognition. New symptoms turned up almost every day. His teeth loosened and dropped out. His skin went a ghastly gray, dotted with patches of black. His organs started to fail, secreting fluids that soaked through his bedding. Servants were required to change the royal bedclothes several times a day, and yet they were still subject to strict ceremonial procedure, including the use of special royal bedding and each change being witnessed by official persons. The result was a grotesque comedy of errors, if it weren't so tragic. His dinners, once a royal show, were now a macabre farce. With his mouth decaying and his breath so pungent that servants gagged, Louis could no longer masticate. He was fed broth and liquids by long straws while keeping up the farce of formal dining rites. Courtiers bowed and smiled and pretended not to see the stench, the trembling hands, the empty eyes, pretending they weren't witnessing the slow-motion death of a legend. The psychological tension was intolerable. Most of the palace servants had worked for the Sun King for many decades, some all their lives. They had worshipped him as a living embodiment of divine power. They were now seeing the breakdown of not only a man, but of a whole system of belief. Their god-king was perishing, visibly, audibly, and appallingly. Some lost their faith, others lost themselves. By mid-September, it was inevitable. The king was dying, and the inevitable was approaching. His periods of lucidity shortened. When clear-headed, he still demanded truncated versions of his favorite rituals, always attempting to keep up appearances. But those instances were few. For the most part, he alternated between being in and out of consciousness, speaking gibberish, summoning people long deceased. Dr. Fagin, desperate now, resorted to bizarre and ghastly remedies. He used animal organs on the king's wounds in the hopes of transferring vital energy. He cauterized infected tissue with hot irons, screaming with pain that was heard at Versailles. Perhaps the most bizarre involved encasing the rotting leg of the king with the hides of newly killed animals, hoping their warmth would stimulate healing. None of it worked. A few remaining family members were trapped in a grisly dilemma. They were obligated to stay, to remain present, dignified, respectful, but their leader was rotting before their eyes. The 5-year-old Dauphin, Louis XV, was kept safely away from the atrocity. But some others weren't so fortunate. They silently witnessed the last ghastly disintegration of the Bourbon legend, and news was spreading. Foreign diplomats who came to Versailles to conduct business of state were confronted by a king so addled he was hardly able to speak coherently. Several left early. A few even canceled their missions altogether. Throughout Europe, word spread like wildfire. The Sun King was dying, and the French court was collapsing. The last days of Louis XIV's life were nearly too ghastly to believe. The stench, the rot, the shattered mind, it ravaged not just the king's body, but the palace's very air. His formerly great rooms stank so overwhelmingly that the stench permeated adjacent corridors. The man who had once controlled Europe's fashion, politics, and religion now shriveled in bed, switching from flashes of clarity to haunting delusion. At times, he would know a servant. At other times, he would shout to friends who had died 40 years or more earlier, believing they stood beside him. They named him the Sun King, a man who was self-appointed to the divine, whose very presence was said to emanate power like that of sunlight itself. Louis XIV of France was more than a king. He was a living embodiment of God's will on earth. But toward the end of his life, this man, surrounded once by glory, was a ghastly reminder that even the greatest are not exempt from decay. It's not the tale of a king's passing, it's the unraveling of a myth, the gradual, horrid unspooling of a god-king who lived and died as a rotting corpse before exhaling his last breath. What you're about to read is the portion of history the royal historians attempted to bury. For 72 years, Louis XIV reigned France unshakably. He constructed Versailles, overpowered Europe, and transformed himself into the embodiment of absolute monarchy. But by 1715, now 76 years of age, he was the sole survivor of his own generation, having outlived his son, grandson, and most of his closest friends. But France was not the same. Wars had depleted the treasury. Harsh winters had led to famine. The glory of Versailles was an empty form. Nobles whispered behind gilded doors, and while Louis held fast to ceremony, going through his daily lever and holding court, actual power had long since slipped from his grasp. Then, on a summer day in July, it started, a throbbing in the king's leg. Initially brushed aside as a trivial strain, it rapidly became sharper, deeper, more unrelenting. His hunger disappeared, his complexion turned white, and soon his brain started to wander. The man who had dominated every discussion now gazed blankly ahead or muttered to himself. Physicians attempted every conventional treatment, bloodletting, herbal poultices, prayers. All were unsuccessful. By August, the throbbing pain in his leg was unbearable. Louis could hardly walk. His servants saw that his once regal figure was shrinking as if his body was withdrawing from life. Worse still, a foul odor had started clinging to him, at first faintly, then irrepressibly. Then there was the terror they could no longer conceal. His leg had started to rot. Gangrene had taken hold. His flesh darkened, seeped, and sloughed off. With each passing day, his valet revealed a more hellish sight. A leg so rotten that even faithful servants retched. Aromatic cloths were pressed against faces. Stockings were worn not to be flashy but to hide rot. But still, the king demanded ritual. He wore royal silks. He received foreign visitors. He kept court, though now the courtiers stood further back, noses turned away discreetly. Many servants left their duties. Those who stayed out of loyalty, and at great cost, subjected to the sickening decay of a disintegrating monarch. The gangrene progressed. His breath became fetid. Black spots covered his chest, and still the king refused to accept the reality. Physicians offered to amputate the leg, a perilous, agonizing operation. Louis refused. When he finally acquiesced, it was too late. The rot had already won out over his body. Then visions began to come. Louis started talking to dead men. He gave commands to invisible servants. He asked questions nobody ever asked. The palace became unnaturally quiet. Even his chaplain started believing that what they saw was divine retribution, the anger of God on a man who pretended to act in his name. Holy relics were imported from all over France. Mass was celebrated around the clock. Even so, Louis's body still kept betraying him. His teeth loosened. His skin grayed. His internal organs began to shut down, oozing fluids onto his bed. Bedding was changed several times a day, but always with the proper royal protocol. Servants ordered to observe form when scrubbing up the fluids of a rotting king. Meals were grotesque parodies. The king no longer ate solid food, and his breath was so bad that servants hovered at a distance to spoon broth into him through straws. And still, the charade continued. Dinners were eaten, audiences were kept. No one had the courage to say the unthinkable. Their king was dying, and not in glory, but in shame. By mid-September, the metamorphosis was all but over. Louis came in and out of consciousness. He continued to receive visitors, a half-dead man wrapped in silk, uttering niceties as his own stench hung in the air. Dr. Fagan and his staff, desperate and powerless, resorted to outlandish remedies, placing animal organs on his skin, burning holes in his flesh with scalding irons, even bandaging his putrid leg in newly skinned hides, hoping warmth would cure what medicine could not. Nothing availed. His family did little more than stand by. His great-grandson, the future Louis XV, was kept from him. But others were not excluded. Foreign ambassadors canceled their visits. Some avoided Versailles altogether. The decline of the king was whispered all over Europe. The Sun King, once the epitome of divine monarchy, was now the epitome of rot, madness, and death. On September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV died at last on the morning. His last breath was not one of dignified grace. It was, said witnesses, a gasp of relief, an end to weeks of unimaginable agony. But even in death, the terror was not over. When embalmers opened his body, they gasped in horror. His organs were liquefied. His intestines had melted into a sludge. The stench was so pungent, several fainted. Most ominously of all, the king's heart, intended to be preserved as a sacred relic, blackened and disintegrated upon contact. The king's corpse was so gas-distended that it only just fit into the specially made coffin. Pillows had to be torn out. The casket was speedily sealed to trap the odors. Louis's funeral was a lavish spectacle, music, incense, orations, processions. But the people closest to the coffin were aware of the reality. The odor of rot still seeped through the cracks. Pallbearers turned sick. Priests hastened their rituals lest they breathe the air. Even the burial was not straightforward. When the coffin was being placed in the royal tomb, the gases contained within had grown to such pressure that officials were afraid it would explode. Emergency ventilation was included. The crypt was sealed in a rush, not out of ceremony, but fear. Monarchs throughout Europe offered condolences. But in private correspondence, nobles penned with astonishment and ghoulish interest on what had transpired. The carefully constructed image of Louis XIV for 70 years was irrevocably tarnished. The immortal Sun King had passed like an ordinary man, and worse, like a corpse already decomposing before dying. In France, the psychological impact was tremendous. His people had believed in the divine right of kings. But what they witnessed at Versailles was not divinity. It was rot. His demise did not mark merely the end of an era. It destroyed a myth. And as his physicians, such as Dr. Fagan, were questioned by their peers, they knew one thing with certainty. No amount of ritual, power, or ceremony can prevent the truth which tormented Louis XIV's last days. Even kings decay. In the last few hours of his life, Louis XIV, the greatest king in Europe, experienced moments of horrific lucidity. In these intermittent moments of clarity, he appeared to understand the sheer horror of his illness. He implored his physicians to end his suffering, first requesting once more the amputation he had steadfastly declined, then begging them to give him more potent medicines to dull his pain. But the doctors of the day had no solution. They could only pray, burn incense, and stand by helplessly as the king rotted before them. The religious ceremonies involved in his death became more hysterical, more desperate. Holy relics were fetched from all over the land. Whole convents and monasteries were recruited to pray for his soul. But nothing could give dignity back to what was becoming a grotesque death. On September 1st, 1715, with early light seeping through Versailles' great windows, Louis XIV finally passed away. It was not a serene dying. Witnesses described his last breath as not a resigning sigh, but a gasping one, as if his body had merely exhausted the battle. But death did not bring any proximal peace. Indeed, the most unsettling chapter still lay ahead. When the embalmers started working, they found that the body of the king was beyond preservation. His internal organs had turned into liquid. His intestines, which are usually removed and kept in a reverent manner, had to be scooped out in handfuls of muck. The stench from his body was so bad that a number of embalmers fainted. His heart, the sacred relic of a god king, was blackened and disintegrated at the touch. The men labored through the night, working desperately to make the body presentable for public viewing. But they were unsuccessful. The elaborate coffin, designed to hold a god king, was barely able to keep in check the puffed-up, gaseous corpse. Padding had to be removed. The lid was hurriedly sealed to hold in the stench and pressure inside. Even the risk of the corpse exploding at the funeral was feared. In spite of the atrocities, the burial was lavish, most probably the most expensive in French history. Thousands marched from Versailles to Saint-Denis. The incense, the music, the golden banners, all to glorify the man in the coffin. But those standing closest to the sealed coffin knew. Even the thickest perfumes and the smoke of incense couldn't cover up the stench. Pallbearers made sick. Priests leading the ceremonies hastily hastened through their prayers so they did not take a deep breath. Even the funeral had to be modified. Excess ventilation was added to the tomb in order to minimize the possibility of an explosion due to the gases building up. The chamber was closed sooner than anticipated. Divine kingship traditions could no longer keep at bay the very human realities they had ignored for so long. More than the ceremonies and funerals, Louis XIV's death ignited something more profound, a crisis of faith. Physicians and scientists started questioning the very principles of conventional medicine. If this was the kind of royal care, what chance did ordinary people have? Philosophers demanded, how could a man who had been appointed by God die such an ignominious, ungodly death? The myth of divine right had been corrupted from within, not through revolution, but through contagion. At Versailles, the psychological wounds cut deeply. Many servants never recovered. Some left royal service altogether, unable to return to rooms where they had watched their sovereign decay. The very spaces he died in were renovated, repainted, redecorated, a desperate attempt to erase the memory. But the past lingered. Some claimed the smell never fully left. The stones, they said, remembered, and so did the people. The political ramifications of Louis's death were vast. Future French monarchs would find it difficult to inspire the same sense of awe. The meticulously crafted image of the divine king had been shattered, not by revolt or scandal, but by a smelly, visible death. During the decades that followed, authors, artists, and philosophers continued to come back to the image of the decaying king, employing it to analyze the vulnerability of power, the self-absorption of glory, and the unavoidable certainty of death. His ultimate legacy, ironically enough, was not the palace he constructed or the battles he fought. It was the memory of his decay. The Sun King, who devoted his life to crafting his legacy, was remembered as much for the manner of his death as for the nature of his reign. His last days stripped bare the pretense of divine right and uncovered the one secret no crown, no title, and no ceremony can conceal. We are all ultimately flesh and blood, vulnerable, temporary, equal before death. The nightmarish demise of Louis XIV was more than the fall of a king. It was the demise of a legend, a harsh but indelible reminder that power wanes, glory festers, and no man, no matter how powerful, is immune to the democracy of death.